This is for educational use only. Our group is allowing our instructor, Mr. Roldar Dennis, to use this as an educational material. So, our topic is all about human trafficking and human rights in migration. So, these are the learning objectives. What is human trafficking? What are examples of human trafficking? What are the three key elements of human trafficking? What is the current state of human trafficking in the Philippines? How can you relate human trafficking to migration? Understanding human rights in migration. And lastly, the adverse effect of human trafficking to globalization. So first is, what is human trafficking? So human trafficking is the exploitation of individual through force, fraud, or coercion for purposes such as forced labor, sexual exploitation, or involuntary servitude. It involves the recruitment, transportation, harboring, or people often using tactics that exploit vulnerabilities such as poverty, lack of education, or social marginalization. Victims may be subjected to physical violence, psychological manipulation, debt bondage, or threats against themselves or their families. Human trafficking is a violation of human rights and affects men, women, and children globally. Efforts to combat trafficking include raising awareness, strengthening laws, prosecuting traffickers, and providing support and protection to victims. Next is human rights in migration. So, human rights in migration encompasses the protection of fundamental rights and dignity throughout the migration process, irrespective of migrants' legal status or reasons for migrating. It ensures non-discrimination, safeguarding migrants from violence and exploitation, and upholding their freedom of movement. This includes fair treatment under the law, access to essential services such as healthcare and education, and the right to maintain family unity. Migrants also have the right to work under fair conditions and seek asylum from persecution. Upholding human rights in migration not only respects migrants' inherent dignity but also fosters inclusive societies and upholds international legal obligations to protect the rights of all individuals, regardless of their nationality or migration status. So, human trafficking and human rights in migration are closely interconnected due to the vulnerability of migrants to exploitation and abuse during the migration process. So, here are some ways in which human trafficking and human rights in migration connect. So, first is vulnerability of migrants. So, migrants, especially those who are undocumented or irregular, are often vulnerable to exploitation and trafficking due to their precarious legal status, lack of social support networks, and limited access to legal protections. Traffickers prey on this vulnerability, promising migrants better opportunities or assisting them in crossing borders illegally, only to exploit them for labor, sex, or other forms of exploitation. Second is forced labor. So, usually, many migrants are trafficked for forced labor, including in industries such as agriculture, construction, domestic work, and manufacturing. They may be subjected to deceptive recruitment practices, debt bondage, confiscation of identity documents, and threats of violence to keep them in exploitative situations. Such practices violate multiple human rights, including the right to work, the right to freedom from slavery and forced labor, and lastly, the right to freedom of movement. Next is sexual exploitation. Trafficking for sexual exploitation is another common form of human trafficking affecting migrants. Women and children are particularly vulnerable to being trafficked into the sex trade, often through deceptive recruitment methods or coercion. This violates their rights to bodily integrity, freedom from violence and exploitation, and also dignity.
So I'm Kenjin Cadet Nutritionist, and my topic is all about the examples of human trafficking. So the examples of human trafficking is one, the sex trafficking. So sex trafficking involves harboring, transportation, provision, or obtaining a person purpose for commercial victims such as sex videos, pornography, and everything. So this is where a victim of sex trafficking may be forced into prostitution, into pornography, or other forms of sexual explosions. So next is the labor trafficking. So the labor trafficking, it is where forced labor, where it's involuntary for child labor, and of course it uses violence, such as, like, example, I work in an industry and then they force me, or they trick me, or they lie to me about my, example, ako sweldo. So they trick me in order for me to keep working in their company. So that is one of the labor trafficking. So next is the child trafficking. So child trafficking is where the children and young peoples were tricked or forced or persuade to leave their homes or move into transported and then exploited. So forced to work or sold. So they're being sold or forced to work. So, and the others will also make them into child pornography, like that. So that are the examples of human trafficking. Thank you.
Human trafficking typically involves three elements. First, act. This refers to the recruitment, transportation, transfer, harboring, or receipt of persons. And the second means. This encompasses the threat of use of force, coercion, adoption, fraud, deception, abuse of power or vulnerability, giving payments or benefits to a person in control of victim. And third, purpose. The ultimate goal is exploitation, which can include forced labor or services, slavery, or practices similar to slavery, servitude, or the removal of organs.
I'm Dean Errol Herrero. Human trafficking. What is its current state in the Philippines? Human trafficking is a pervasive issue in the Philippines, and it's crucial to understand its current state. The presentation will explore the scope of the problem, the types of trafficking that occur, vulnerable population, and the government's efforts to combat it. By raising awareness, we can work together to end this exploitation. The scope of the problem. The Philippines is a major source of victims for both sex and labor trafficking. Estimates suggest hundreds of thousands of Filipinos are trapped in modern slavery. The COVID-19 pandemic may have exacerbated the situation due to economic hardship. The Philippines is a complex region, transit, and destination country for human trafficking. The exact or victim is difficult to determine, but is a significant issue. The pandemic economic impacts might have pushed more people into vulnerable situations where they are susceptible to trafficking. Types of trafficking. Sex trafficking, exploiting people for prostitution or sexual services. Labor trafficking, forcing people to work in involuntary servitude, domestic work, or other sex factors. Other forms, child solidary, organ trafficking, and forced marriage. Sex trafficking and labor trafficking are the most common types in the Philippines. Traffickers exploit vulnerabilities like poverty and lack of education to lure victims. Children are especially susceptible, but adults are also targeted. Government efforts. The Philippines is classified as Tier 1 by the U.S. Department of State. This indicates the government meets minimum standards to eliminate trafficking. Efforts include law enforcement, victim protection, and prevention campaigns. The Philippine government is actively working to combat trafficking. Their Tier 1 ranking demonstrates their commitment law. Enforcement works to apprehend trafficking, while victim protection programs provide support to survivors. Public awareness campaigns are also crucial in prevention.
How can you relate human trafficking to migration? So first is exploitation of victims. Traffickers use all sorts of methods to recruit victims for the purpose of exploitation. And the second is seeking a better life. So migrant smugglers take advantage of people who want to escape hardship and find a better life, facilitating their illegal entry into a country. So example is USA and Mexico. So while it's a clear distinction between human trafficking and migrant smuggling, they can also be linked human. So the migrant smugglers take advantage of people who want to live in their home countries to escape poverty, conflict, and crisis, or simply want to seek a better life, even if irregular migrants generally enter into the journey voluntarily. They are often exposed to significant risks, including that of being trafficked, kidnapped, or dying in the transit of their destination.
I am the continuation of this topic, which is how can you relate human trafficking to migration? Human trafficking and migration are intricately linked phenomena that share commonalities but are also distinct in their motive and outcomes. While migration involves the voluntary movement of people from one place to another, human trafficking entails the coercion and exploitation of individuals for various purposes. However, these two phenomena intersect in multiple ways, often resulting in migration becoming victims of trafficking. One significant way in which human trafficking relates to migration is through the exploitation of vulnerable migration. Many migrants, particularly those fleeing poverty, conflict, and persecution, are in desperate situation, making them easy targets for trafficker. For example, imagine a young woman from a rural village in Nigeria dreaming of better life in Europe, lacking economic opportunities at home. She falls prey to traffickers who promise her a job as a nanny in Italy. However, upon arrival, she discovered that she has been sold in sexual slavery. In this scenario, migration was the initially intent, but it is led to trafficking due to woman vulnerability and the traffickers' exploitation. Migration routes and network are often exploited by traffickers to transport their victims. Traffickers frequently use the same routes and methods as migrants, such as smuggling network and illegal border crossing to move their victims across the border. In some cases, migrants themselves may become victims of trafficking during their journey. For instance, a group of migrants traveling through Central America to reach United States. Along the way, they are intercepted by traffickers who force them into labor or prostitution. Here, the migrant intended migrations become intertwined with trafficking as they are exploited during transit. The demand for cheap labor in destination countries are also drive to migration, and trafficking industries such as agriculture, construction, and domestic work rely heavily on migrant labor. However, unscrupulous employees or traffickers implicit these demands by subjecting migrant workers to abusive working conditions, long wage, and debt bondage. For example, again, migrant workers from Southern Asia seeking employment in the construction sectors and media is may find themselves trapped in exploitative contract, forced to work long hours and dangerous conditions with little pay. Human trafficking and migration are closely intertwined, with migration of serving as precursor to trafficking due to migrant vulnerabilities and exploitation of migrant routes. Addressing human trafficking requires address on root cause of migration, providing greater protection and combination the demand of exploitative labor by understanding the complex relationship between trafficking and migration. Policy marker and stakeholders can work toward effective solution to combat both phenomena and ensure the safety and dignity of all migrants.
Understanding human rights and migration. First, right to life and security. A migrant right to life and security includes defense against abuse, exploitation, and prejudice both in transit and once they reach their new country. 2. Right to liberty and freedom of movement. According to their rights to liberty and freedom of the movement, migrants must be not arbitrarily detained and must be allowed to travel freely within a nation's borders, unless reasonable and necessary limits are in place to further unjustifiable cause. Number 3. Right to seek asylum. The principle of non-refoulement statement that individuals who are escaping persecution, violence, or violations of the human rights have the right to apply for asylum in other nations and should not be sent back to the place where their safety or freedom is in jeopardy. 4. Right to work and education. Regardless of their immigration status, migrants have the rights, employment, and educational opportunities. They must be shaded labor exploitations and granted fair pay and working conditions. 5. Right to fair treatment in a legal proceeding. Refugees and asylum seekers alike have the rights to prompt and ad- equitable access to legal procedures and remedies, including the rights to counsel and fair trials. 6. Right to non-discrimination. Discriminations against migrants ought to be prohibited on the ground of the nationality, race, ethnicity, gender, religions, or any other attribute. Equal treatment and opportunities such as a job and a service access are their rights.
The adverse effect of human trafficking in globalization. So human trafficking's impact on globalization is profound and negative. It undermines human rights, fosters inequality, and impedes economic development by exploiting vulnerable populations and creating social instability. Additionally, it tarnishes the reputation of nations involved and hampers international cooperation and trust. Human trafficking distorts labor markets by driving down wages and working conditions, which can ultimately hinder fair competition and economic growth. It also fuels organized crime networks, weakening the rule of law and institutions crucial for effective governance. Moreover, the transnational nature of human trafficking complicates efforts and address it as coordination among countries becomes essential but often challenging to achieve. This undermines the potential benefits of globalization, such as increased trade and cultural exchange, by fostering an environment of exploitation and injustice. So, for example, here in Philippines, the adverse effect of human trafficking in the context of globalization are significant. One example is the trafficking of Filipino women and children for the purpose of sexual exploitation abroad. Many are lured by false promises of legitimate employment opportunities, only to find themselves trapped in exploitative situations once they arrive in other countries. The global demand for cheap labor and sexual services fuels this trafficking, as well as the ease of international travel and communication enabled by globalization.